You know, I've been asked several times on homeschooling, what is homeschooling and why do we homeschool? And it seems like in the church particularly that question is raised. We homeschool, we say, because we want our children to have a better education. We homeschool because we want them to be closer to the family. We homeschool because we're concerned about curriculum taught in the public schools. A myriad of reasons that come up. But I think I was given the answer best by a woman probably 5 years ago. And she said, you know, I'm homeschooling because I want my children to go with me back to my Father in heaven. And I've thought about that many times because so frequently we look at homeschooling as a matter of curriculum. What do we learn? And we put the accent on academia. And that accent on academia seems to really water us down to be like so many others. We're concerned about things. We're concerned about knowledge in the broad scale without comprehending the real knowledge, the knowledge of most worth, is to become like our Father in heaven, to learn all that we can from the earthly experience, but do it under the fellowship and guise of a celestial education. That comes out in many different ways. I think if one looks at history, you can see the same thing creeping in with the saints, the early saints. And we're talking about in the 1860s, 1870s in Utah. We understand that prior to that time, the Kirtland Temple was used as a school, and there are other schools that were used also. Not so much as we would use a school now. In fact, the Kirtland Temple was kind of interesting because that was for adults more than youth. The idea was the families, the parents, would go to the Kirtland Temple and they would learn academic subjects, but again, flavored with Mormonism. And they would learn things and then be responsible to take those things back to their children and teach them in the home. So the school wasn't for the children. The school was for the parents to learn to teach their children. You think of what that does as far as breaking down education, who's responsible for what. To me, it makes a great deal of sense. In fact, if I can veer for just a minute also before I go back to this one area that I want to talk about. Years ago, I had the opportunity of meeting with President Alvin R. Dyer. And Alvin R. Dyer at that time had just written the book, The Refiner's Fire, a wonderful book, and I recommend that to everyone, talking about Missouri and the promises of Missouri in the latter days. I was interviewing at that point to become a seminary teacher. And as I sat down with President Dyer, we talked for a while in generalities, and then he stopped the conversation. And when I asked him about the book and the temples that he had written about in The Refiner's Fire, he looked at me and he said, "How would you like to teach in the temple?" Well, I've thought about that many times since, but I thought about that at the time because he said, if you teach in the temple, you'll be able to teach a curriculum to parents. And that was the key. He felt that all schooling in the millennium would be home education, homeschooling. He went on to say that if you look at the plat map of the city of Zion, you see a 24 temple complex. It's a neat complex, and yet something we don't identify with today in temples. But he said 12 of the temples were Aaronic priesthood temples, and 12 were Melchizedek priesthood temples. And he said probably, as far as his understanding went, the Aaronic priesthood temples would be used for schooling, for education. That would be the place where parents would learn to be parents and learn about celestial principles to take home to their children and teach those principles. I've thought about that many times since because that really hones in to what I feel education should be. Well, now the saints have come to Utah, and of course we had our own environment here. It was a kind of a once-in-a-lifetime experience to be able to come to a new place where most of the people were Latter-day Saints. They could do what they wanted. They could treat education as they felt it should be treated. And in those early Utah days, and we're talking about the 1850s, 60s, 70s, in those days, people were able to come to the small towns in Utah, not so much the large cities, because they did have a Gentile influence at that time, but the small towns. And the school boards were made up of usually the bishoprics and other individuals who had some educational expertise. And they were able to teach things in their own local schools as they felt things ought to be taught. They did that in a number of different areas. Some were academic, but more importantly, they taught about those principles of the church. They had Book of Mormon classes, they had New Testament, Old Testament classes, they talked about prophets and living prophets, they talked about lectures on faith by Joseph Smith. But all those things would weave in academia with that celestial learning that should take place. And then it seems like they lost it after a while. They lost it during the 1870s primarily and into the 1880s. And why? Because there were those who felt they could come to Utah and convert Mormons back to Christianity. And by saying that, we had a number of mission schools, if you will. That's what they were called, mission schools. They said they'd more or less given up on the adults, the Mormon adults, because they couldn't be convinced. But they could grasp the teaching of the youth, and they could teach the youth pretty much what they wanted. They felt that was the wedge to destroy Mormonism. Well, how'd they do it? They did it because they were individuals who had degrees, academic degrees from all over the place, and they looked pretty good. And they certainly were academically brilliant people who came into the area here, the Congregationalist Church, the Methodist Church. They were some of the primary ones, the Episcopalian Church. And they then formed their own schooling. And you know, Mormons have always liked the idea of education, and it sounded good to Latter-day Saints to be able to go to schools that were taught by those who had these highfalutin degrees, if I can use the wording. And it was a concern among the early saints. In fact, the saints later began their own school system because they had to reject the idea of people coming simply because they had degrees in teaching. I guess we do that a little bit, don't we? We get kind of high on degrees, and we seem to think that the more letters a person has after their name, the better teacher they must be. There is a comment by Brigham Young. I'd like to read that. It really fits in here. And Brigham was talking about just this problem of people sending their children to non-LDS teachers. And he said, are you going to pay a Gentile school teacher for his good looks? That's what some of our bishops want to do. If they can get a man, no matter what his moral qualities may be, whose shirt front is well starched and ironed, they will say, bless me, you're a delightful little man. What a smooth shirt you have got. And you've got a ring on your finger. You're going to teach our school for us. And along comes a stalwart man, axe in hand, going to chop wood, and if he asks, do you want a school teacher? Though he may know 5 times more than the dandy, he is told, no, we have one engaged. I want to cuff you bishops back and forth until you get your brains turned right side up. What he was saying was, we seem to be so enamored with other things that we call education, when in reality, the education probably that we have is some of the best education in the world. We have more people speaking foreign languages in our country. We have more people recognizing what truth is, and the fact that all the gospel of Jesus Christ encompasses all truth. And so by saying that, we're saying we reject nothing that's true. It's pretty broad in its scope. David O. McKay at one time made the statement when people were going back east for various degrees and learning different things to come out west with these great degrees from Harvard, Yale, whatever the Ivy League schools. David O. McKay said, why do we have to go back east? We have all the education here that we need. Not just all that we need, we probably have more than anyone else has, because we don't filter it down, we don't water it down with untruth. It's true education. Well, those things I think are extremely important when we look at education and what education is. Now, when we get into homeschooling itself, and what is homeschooling, now we're talking about something to the here and now. We've talked about pioneer times and the fact that it was true, and let's stay with what truth is, and let's not worry about the source so much. Let's look at truth and what it is. Section 88 of the Doctrine and Covenants contains a great deal of what you and I need to know in education. In fact, it's interesting looking at Section 88 of the Doctrine and Covenants. The Lord talks about a myriad of things that we need to learn that are considered part of the education pact. But he always prefaces things with learning of spiritual matters. Those things are most important. After one has a spiritual foundation, go ahead and build on that with academia. That's not saying academia is not important. It's simply saying there's an order of things. And if we're truly to understand what education is, we better get the foundation right first. Let's look at that today. There are a number of individuals today who seem to look at education, homeschooling, home education. It's going through a surgence right now that we never thought would happen. I can recall becoming involved in the home education program in the church. And this has been probably 15, 20 years ago. And at that time, it was a very unique thing if a person said, I educate my children at home. And now it seems to be almost mainstream. There are many who say, I educate my children at home. The difference is how they're educated. And I can recall when we first began working with homeschooling and the LDS Home Educators Association, many different groups that would start and began talking about what education was. We said, education at home is at a mother's knee. And learning those things that are most important, back to that original premise here, my job is to teach so that my children can return to their Father in heaven. My job isn't to inculcate them with math statistics, with learning all the various formulas of this and that. That's not the issue. That will come if the foundation is right. But the foundation says we grow up at our mother's knee. We learn from the great books, if you will. We learn from many things that are good, viable things to read. At the same time, we do it in an environment of asking questions and having those questions answered. I think of a wonderful woman who, in her homeschooling, would talk about, would begin the day always with a prayer, with a devotional of sorts, not too formal, but mainly reading. Just pick up something the children wanted to read. And she said at one point, they were doing this one September morning, and the school bus was out in front of the home, and the school bus was rounding all the children up in that neighborhood and taking them to school. And one of the little daughters at the home said, oh, they get to go to school. How come we have to stay home? And it was quickly turned around where, yes, those poor kids, they have to leave their mother and they go to school and have a public education. And that's good for them, but isn't it much more convenient to be at home here, nice to be at home, and just to be able to sit on the couch and read together and talk about things that are important, rather than having some person disinterested in that student asking a set of predetermined questions with perhaps predetermined responses. Instead, having that child at his mother's knee saying, Mommy, what about this? What about that? And the neat thing is, Mommy doesn't always have the answers. And that's good, because now Mommy and daughter or son can find those answers together. That's what homeschooling is. Homeschooling isn't sitting in front of a computer. It's not sitting in front of a predetermined set of textbooks, simply going through the textbooks and worksheets and whatever you have. But home education is the entire home. It's the family together. It's husband, wife, and generally the husband's at work. But he gets involved in this too. But mainly mom with the kids. And you know, that gets to be kind of exciting. You get some of these large families, 7, 8 children, even more. And they're at different levels, aren't they? But in a home environment, a homeschooling environment, they begin having their own devotional. They're working on different things at different levels. But mom can work with all those children individually. Who knows them better than mom does? And obviously the teacher at school doesn't know them better. And all the other public sources that we have for education really don't know that child at all. They put them in a class. And in that class, they tried to have a one-size-fits-all approach. I know as a father that doesn't work. We used to talk about the here and now, bridging the gap. How does the book of Helaman apply to you and I today? How does the book of Ether apply to you and I today? And boy, you can spend a lot of time with that. So many things that seem to have a direct revelation and direct relation to where you and I are today with scriptures. History, if it's been said over and over again that he who does not comprehend history is condemned to repeat history. And so very true. And yet sometimes we have a very mitigated view of history that we get from our textbooks, from the media. And there are other ways to look at things from a gospel perspective. So homeschooling will do that. And if mom is concerned because she doesn't have all the answers, so much the better. How much better is it to be taught by someone who recognizes they don't know all the answers than to someone who has a degree and therefore is supposed to know the answers and might try to bluff their way through it for my children. Things to look at. There has been, over and over again, with this new movement toward homeschooling, and the movement seems to emphasize the fact that if the child is at home, he's being homeschooled or home taught. And let me just give you a personal impression of that. Not so. Just because the child is at home, working with somebody else's curriculum, working with question-answer forms, sitting in front of a computer, that is not homeschooling. That simply has taken a leaf from educational curriculum and brought it into the home, but that's somebody else's curriculum. Are those things that you think are important? Well, maybe some of them are. But chances are things that are more important will be those things about drawing us near to our Father in heaven, drawing us near to the families, and discussing things as a family. And so that computer might come in handy every now and then. That's not the babysitter we want. We want something that will stimulate the minds of the children, create questions, create an environment where there's real learning taking place and drawing them nearer to their Father in heaven. I look at some other aspects of home education that are really important. We have always enjoyed getting families together, working together. Co-op education, we call that. Co-op what? In other words, a family, you might have 5 different families. They have children roughly the same ages, and they can get together and do things together. I'm thinking of a young woman in our ward right now, and she's about 12 years old, an excellent pianist. And she was taking music lessons at school, but she was so far superior to her own teacher in school that her teacher really couldn't give her very much in her music environment. And so her mother said, as long as I'm running all over for lessons and doing this and that, why don't I do everything at home? And we've had the opportunity of talking. And this little girl is getting real home education now. Yeah, that's part of it with her music. But she's also finding the other time is extremely valuable. Let me share some experiences with you in homeschooling. Homeschooling for us has been a major shift in our lives and things that we've done. My wife and I began homeschooling several years ago with one of our sons, Ross. And he was having a hard time at school. He was a bright student. However, in many cases, he was far beyond where his teachers are willing to take him. They have had certain parameters, and those parameters were basically what the book said. And Ross was one who liked other types of learning, so he got into trouble. And he was not popular in his school, and finally we took him out of school. And that was a story all on its own, because we're the first people in that county to ever have taken a child out of school. But we did, and we said, Ross, what would you like to learn? See, there's a key to homeschooling. Where does that child go? Where does he want to go? What does he want to learn? And so we don't force things down that child. We don't say you have to learn this, period 1, 2, and 3, and 4. We don't compartmentalize his learning. We let him dream. What do you want to learn? And by the way, when you do that, you can fit all other subjects into it. It's kind of exciting because there's no real one way to teach. We opened that up as a family. And so we said, Ross, what do you want to learn? And it took him 2 or 3 days to really come up with something. He just sat for the longest time, experimenting, reading books and looking. And finally he said, Dad, I think I'd like to learn about the Constitution. Well, the Constitution, as you and I know, is an inspired document. And so we were able to go to section 101, section 98 of the Doctrine and Covenants, talking about the Constitution, laying a foundation for it. And then from that point, going into the actual Constitution. I think today he has a better understanding of the Constitution than virtually anyone that I know, because he studied that per se, just looked at the document itself, learning all that he could about it and reading books about it by the Founding Fathers. Well, that didn't simply stay with the Constitution again. He was able to broaden that into other areas also. But I looked at that as one of our first experiences in homeschooling. We had another wonderful experience with a daughter. We happened to go to China with BYU. We went there about 15 years ago. And this daughter didn't like being in school, in public school. She was a sharp girl. In fact, she was voted student body president that year of her high school, but she didn't want to be there. She was there and she was good at what she did, but she wanted something different. She wanted a different environment. And so she came into our bedroom one time and she said, I just can't go back to that school again. They believe in different things that I believe in. I'm working with students who want to do different things that I want to do. And so after talking to her, my wife and I said, well, by the way, we're thinking of going to China this year. Would you like to come with us? And she just got excited about going to China. We went there for a year. She gave up her position as student body president. And we went to China. She wanted to get a degree, and so she worked through BYU still in their education field, although that wasn't her main area of interest. When she went to China, homeschooling was a homeschooling like I've never seen before. She was able to get involved with the culture, the personalities of the people, and that was homeschooling. We weren't concerned about period 1 and period 2. We were concerned about the overall influence and learning while you could learn in that kind of culture and environment. That's true homeschooling. Let me share another experience. Years ago, I was involved in a bishopric, and we had a ward where many people were homeschooling. In fact, over half the ward were homeschoolers. And in that particular ward, we had some students excelling in homeschooling, and we had other students who were not quite as involved, but were still learning from their homeschool environment. And one young man, his name was James, because everyone else was being homeschooled, wanted to be homeschooled too. And so he announced to us that he was going to be homeschooled the next year. He'd been a freshman in high school the year before. James was a gangly 6'2" young man, totally uncoordinated, read on a second grade level, was the pun of most, or the brunt of most of the jokes that were told among the freshman class, and totally unaccepted in the environment, in that public school environment, and felt like he was a nobody, that he couldn't do anything right. And so when he announced that he wanted to be a homeschooler, well, that didn't sound too bad until you recognized what his parents were and how they'd brought him up. His mother was a woman who enjoyed the soap operas from morning till night. She would watch soap operas, and that's all she did. The father couldn't hold down a job, and the family was on welfare. And as the bishopric looked at that particular case, we said, are you sure, James, you want to be homeschooled? And of course what we had reference to was, can your parents handle you as being a homeschool student in that environment? Well, he did have his way, and he began to be homeschooled that year, his sophomore year. And he sat down initially with his mother when school began, and he sat down on the couch and he watched television with her. And finally, after a day or two, he said, Mom, can we do something else for homeschooling? Do I have to sit and watch the soap operas? And his mother said, yeah, go read a book. Well, remember, he read on the second grade level. He didn't read well at all. But after a week of watching soap operas, he said, anything is better than this. And he forced himself to learn how to read. He read and read, got harder and harder books, till finally, At the end of that year, he was reading on an 11th grade level. He taught himself how to do it. And in the process, he decided television really didn't have the answer at all. And so he began branching out into other areas, other fields. And he learned that he had leadership qualities. He became an Aaronic priesthood leader in the ward. He found that he could influence others with what he was doing. Leadership just oozed from the boy when he was able to get out of that public school environment. I'm not saying that public school environment is necessarily bad. However, we know there's some social issues there that sometimes we'd rather not expose our children to. And in this case, it allowed him to grow and to flourish, not to be involved in that public school environment. Is homeschooling good? In that case, it was wonderful for him. In fact, in virtually every case I can think of, it's been a wonderful area. Now, we're talking about academics. We're talking about spirituality. We're talking about bringing those two things together and teaching children. Remember, at the outset of this discussion, I made the statement that homeschooling or any type of education, the thrust should be to bring that child back to our Father in heaven. It's not how much he knows about various formulas and statistics. Instead, is that child prepared to go back to his Father in heaven saying, I had an earthly experience, I learned these things, I did these things. And by having done them, is a better person and has literally taken advantage of all that we have here. Hasn't been washed under with the various things that are thrown at us. Anyway, with that, I think of so many situations. Let me just mention one more quick one. I have a very good friend in Oregon. She was Teacher of the Year in Oregon, so she's sharp. And this woman decided that she would stop teaching in the public environment and just homeschool her granddaughter. And in that homeschooling process, she began when the girl was about 8 years old, and they went through a myriad of different things, different books and so forth, and this woman would read things and work right along side by side with her. It's not a case of read this and then talk to me afterwards, but let's read together. And as questions come up, let's discuss together. And if I don't know the answer, we'll find the answer together. That's what homeschooling is. This young lady, at the age of 13, had pretty well accomplished what they had in mind. And so at that point, the grandmother said, why don't you go to community college? And began learning some things there from another source. And you have a good foundation at this point. Let's let that mature. And so they went to the community college in Oregon, and they said she would like to attend. And they said, at 13 years of age, there's no way you can attend. You won't know the things that need to be known. And so she was able to take the admissions test and scored the highest that anyone had ever scored on the admissions test, and they couldn't deny her from that point. And so she became a full-fledged community college student. After a year, she graduated from community college. She was ready now for a 4-year college. She was 14 years old. Sharper than they come. Academically, she was brilliant. However, had she been in a public school environment, that never would have matured. We wouldn't have known that about her. In writing the book, Reveal Educational Principles in the Public Schools, I interviewed one of the vice presidents at BYU, and we talked about homeschooling students and how do homeschoolers do at BYU. And as we discussed it, the young man who was the vice president said, you know, we find that academically, the homeschooling students are the best self-motivated students that we have. They're the best students at BYU. We like them, but, and here is the but, he said, unfortunately, most of the homeschooling students that want to come to BYU are 13, 14, 15 years old. BYU is what's called a marriage institution, and we like to couple husbands and wives together and get them sealed in temples and begin BYU as their platform for their livelihood in the future. And he said, you know, we have these 13-year-old children walking around campus. We don't know what to do with them. And so we have to look at academics and look at the spiritual progress that's made. And perhaps in some environments that might be difficult. There's no question, however, that academically the homeschooling student is more prepared for life than the other students. No question at all. If parents will use their role as parents the way they should be used.